really until he became too ill to read, he was always the first person that read something I wrote and the last person that read something I wrote. He was the first person I'd write if I got a grant or an interview or a job. He was the first person I write if I got declined. If I found someone online criticizing my work, or I became convinced, which happened on, unfortunately, rather regular basis, that I was in the wrong career altogether. I talked to him, and with a sentence, he would make the anxiety subside, usually with a joke. But then he'd turn to wanting to hear a story about my kids, or if my cats were still tearing up the house. And I really can't capture what made him such a transformative mentor. It was a combination of his dedication, his goodness, his incredible brilliance, but also his insistence that the work that we're doing matters beyond our careers and beyond our fields. I think we all know this in theory, but Mark lived every day with the urgency and an acute awareness that the way that we understand history, the way we understand our place in the world, was part of transforming it. And his dedication to democracy and to equality were not in any way abstract. They were, at least in my experience, they were the result of his aggregated compassion for everyone whom he knew. He wasn't naive, but his faith in and investment in literally everyone that crossed his path was shocking. He would be so deeply, deeply concerned about the freshman that was not doing well in his class, you almost didn't know how to respond to. You're like, are you serious right now? Not that it's, I mean, he called out the best and most noble parts in people. So this is a long way of saying that I've long been grappling with a profound and intellectual and personal debt to Mark. And of course, I want to pay this forward, and I find a way to pay this forward in my own teaching. But that, for some reason, that recommendation rings hollow for me, because as much as I can try to mimic the actions that he did, the spirit that animated Mark cannot be duplicated. I knew before I graduated that I wanted to dedicate my book to Mark. I wanted to acknowledge him personally, but also I wanted to mark a tribute to all of the virtues that he embodied. I never told him because I knew he would have gone to great lengths to scuttle. Probably quite dramatic lengths to stop me from doing it. And in the last year, I was worried that he would think he was getting some sort of special treatment because he was ill. And the fact that Mark died without knowing this is the only regret I have from my time working with Mark. Studying with him was and will remain one of the greatest honors of my life.
I'm Jim Barrett, Mark's friend and colleague. I saw the program for the first time when I came in today, and I knew there was something wrong with being last, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Now that I've heard the various presentations, it sinks in. On the other hand, we each have our own sort of angle of vision on Mark, and mine might be different from others. This is a wonderful tradition to celebrate rather than to mourn the life that has passed. And as you've seen during the past hour, there's an enormous amount to celebrate in Mark's life. But with the exception of my wife and my son, Mark was my best friend. And I can certainly tell you that what this feels like is a great loss rather than celebration. As I'm sure it does to Mark's extended family, not just the beloved local family here, but I'm aware that the extended family is with us today. It's a great loss to his colleagues in the Department of History and across the campus. It's a great loss to his many students spread out across the country, and even to many citizens of our community who might not have had an opportunity to know Mark well, but do recognize the difference he made in this wonderful community. Doug Kibbe was kind enough to offer to read my comments today. Doug knows me rather well. I thought for sure I wouldn't be able to get through this, but I realized there was a problem. Not all, but a lot of my comments are in longhand, and my handwriting is not nearly as bad as Mark's handwriting, but it's not very good. So you're gonna get me. We had scholarly interests that overlapped, but this actually had little to do with what I prized in Mark's friendship. First, as been mentioned in various ways by a number of people, Mark was the most ethical person. Mark was the most ethical person that I've ever encountered. And he translated this into his everyday dealings with people. That is, simply, he was an excellent person. One of the finest I've known, among a rather illustrious group. Our few disagreements usually involved me trying sort of a shortcut on something. An ethical shortcut, if you will. And Mark insisting that instead we should do the right thing. Mark was always right. It's been mentioned, I think it was a very good thing that's been mentioned a couple times, that Mark was not able to appreciate himself. And we all regret that. I think that I proclaimed it as often as I possibly could how wonderful he was, but it didn't take. But I did have one thing to say about that, and it's probably occurred to other people here, that if Mark had recognized his worth, to those around him, to those in this room, and to those that can't be with us today, if he had recognized that, then he would probably not have been the Mark that we knew. He consistently put himself dead last with everyone else, and especially his students, ahead of himself. And you have to love a guy like that. But he also had extremely high social ethics, which has been mentioned by a number of people here, and so I'm cutting and pasting as I go along, and I won't go into a lot of detail because some of this has been mentioned by others. He had probably the keenest sense of social justice than anyone I know, possible exception of my son. Active in the union throughout. He stepped on campus the first day and joined the union. Very active in the ACLU, in the faculty senate, and really any place where he thought he could make this a better world. Most of us simply don't think enough about that. Mark was completely consumed by that effort. Mark cured me, and this is a big deal. Mark cured me of any remaining animus I had toward liberals. Mark was a liberal, but he was a liberal of the best possible sort. Worth far more in the thick of a fight than any armchair Marxist. We often worked together here on campus and in the community, causing as much trouble as we possibly could, but all in an effort to make this a better place. And Mark was more dedicated than I was to that, and also more talented. I greatly admired both things, his commitment, but also his talent as an organizer. Megan mentioned that really very close to the time of his death, when Mark was quite ill, he continued organizing for the union. And she was a little bit abstract. I hope I'm not insulting too many people in here, but basically what she's talking about is that he went north of Green Street. And he went into the electrical engineering department and into computer science and didn't seem to worry about that. I'm not going in there, but... So my opinion, which some of you may not share, is that actually this is a pretty corrupt society and system. And another thing that I'm going to miss is Mark's efforts to change that. We really needed all that. He was quite good at it as well as being there. Mark, it's been mentioned, I won't go into any detail, was an extremely sharp and funny fellow, so that he kept me entertained. And we all need that. I'm just going to mention a couple of examples of this. One is, it was actually a very serious topic. Mark, I think increasingly, was concerned about his memory and that he was losing his memory, and we talked a lot about that. And so one day, over lunch I think it was, I asked him to see if he could explain to me, what is it that's actually happening? You know, can you describe to me what's happening? So he said, yeah, I think I can. He said, you know how you have a file cabinet, and then you go through the file cabinet? And I thought he was going to say, and then you can't remember what it was you were looking for? But instead he said, well, it's like a file cabinet, but there's no folders in it. Somebody mentioned Mark's sense of direction, and again, I won't go into any detail. The guy is not with us today to defend himself. But I can associate myself with it as well. Shortly after he arrived, I had probably been here a year, we came close to one another, and I was on the search committee that found Mark. We were supposed to go to a reception at Allerton, and so I can tell some of you know, you could understand if you drove out into the country and you were not familiar with the countryside and roads and everything, you could understand how someone might get lost. But we got lost getting out of town. We could not find a way to get out of town. And I have to say that this was mostly Mark's fault. So, very, 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 very funny. The Italian trip has been mentioned by Chip Burkhart. It was really a wonderful moment. As I think Chip kind of suggested, when you got Mark into that situation, he really enjoyed himself, and as a result, everyone else enjoyed themselves a lot more. We always thought, of course, that we were going to have a lot more of those trips, and the reason I mention that is if you have close friends, you shouldn't take that for granted. None of us know what's going to happen, and you know, I certainly don't know what's going to happen, and I wish we had Mark here with us for longer. His interest in politics has been mentioned a couple of times. The only thing that a couple of people mentioned this obliquely, but Mark was interested in all politics. And this was great for me. I talked to him a lot about politics, very broadly defined now. I'm not just talking about electoral politics, but power in society. And this was great, not only because I could skip articles in the Times or the Nation, all of which Mark read, and he would tell me sort of what was happening, and then I don't have to read them. But more importantly, I could also skip Rush Limbaugh and various other lunatics on that side of things. And Mark was right, and I was wrong. What Mark said is that you have to understand the place these people are coming from. And actually, he was right, it's very important. The rest of us lack the patience to do that. But in the process of listening to Mark, you know, we learned a lot about that. If you watched Mark, he showed you how to live a good life. He was in love with his wife and with his kids. And partly to regain my composure, I'll just tell one more story. This is from Fred Jayer, who actually passed away from cancer just a couple of months before Mark died. And I won't go into any of the gory details, but the truth is that Fred was from an era in the history department that was different. I'll just say there was a lot going on in the history department at that time, and various divorces and so forth. And Fred was disgusted with people like Mark because he said they made the history department very boring. They're just sort of wrapped up with their families, and they don't, you know. And he certainly was wrapped up with his family. The kids have been mentioned a couple times. We saw these kids grow up. I could go on at great length. The best thing I can say about them is that they're very typical Leffs. They always start everything with an apology, but they always get around to something very important. We've really been privileged to watch them grow up, and they reflect Mark and Carol in wonderful ways. And as half a dozen people have mentioned, we're going to have that with us for some time to come, and that's very comforting. I wanted to very, very briefly mention Mark's scholarship, because not too much has been said about that, although you could derive a lot from what Julie and Megan had to say. The truth, which a lot of people know, is that in terms of actually publishing, there was less of that in Mark's case than there was in some other cases. And this is not so difficult to explain. He was an absolute perfectionist. That's a reflection to some extent of his personality, which a couple of people have explained to us. He would simply not publish things that some of us, many of us I think, would consider sort of good enough for government work. But the work, if you take the time to look at it, is superb. It's closely documented. It's very incisive. In other words, it's loaded with very sharp sort of observations. And I have to say it's more honest than a lot of historical scholarship that I read. I mean, he really sort of comes to terms with things, doesn't cut any corners. He was best, though, it's true, and this has been mentioned a couple of times, in commenting on other people's work. He's improved other people's work over the course of his own career. And this is also sometimes misunderstood. This extremely kind and supportive and self-effacing guy, some people know what's coming, was capable of excruciating critiques. Mark would begin, "I'm sure I have just misunderstood something." And then you would think to yourself, "Oh my God." But it helped us. It helped all of us, many of us, in many ways. And I know my own work was infinitely better as a result of Mark's input on it. The last book that I read, he read two entire drafts of it, and it's much, however good or bad it might be, it's a much, much better book than it would have been without him. And we won't have that anymore either. This is in keeping with the theme that he should certainly be celebrated, but we've lost an awful lot here. I've saved just one remark for Mark's teaching to the last, because as a couple of people have mentioned, he was above all a teacher, and he was an absolutely superb teacher. I take teaching very seriously, and Mark was simply the best. He accomplished the impossible, and I'm very glad that Charles Stewart is here with us today, because I believe he can corroborate this. There were colleagues in the history department, these people I'm not going to name, whose evaluations, the evaluation of their teaching, were a bit lower than other people's. And their explanation, kind of logically, if you think about it, is that they were grading too hard. They were demanding too much of students, and as a result, they couldn't also expect high teaching evaluations. So Charles Stewart, who was a very good chair, had a good idea. He decided to do a regression analysis with variables being grading and teaching evaluations. And you can probably guess where this is headed, but it's a fact that Mark's grading was, if not the most rigorous in the department, just about the most rigorous. He was a very demanding teacher. He had set very high standards. And it turns out that students are not as stupid as we think they are. Students gave him very high evaluations. He was right at the top in terms of his evaluations, and right just about at the bottom in terms of his grading and his demands. I learned an enormous amount from him about teaching, and I think teaching is the most important occupation in the world. Brain surgeons are great, and rocket scientists are great, but somebody had to teach them. And Mark's teaching was different from other people. It conveyed not only a knowledge and or even an understanding, but a real sense of sort of democracy and justice. He did this really through all of his teaching, whether that was in the Senior Learning Center, the medium security prison at Danville, in adult education classes, or of course here on campus. So I'm done. I did want to celebrate, above everyone, along with everyone, want to celebrate Mark's life, but it's really a great loss as well, and we're here, I'm supposed to do both things, to celebrate him and also to observe that loss. So thank you very much.
I've been rather dreading this day when I had time to think about it at all. But I'm just overcome by everybody who's here and everything that was said. I can't tell you how much that helped. And all I think we can do now is have a good stiff drink.
All right, I gotta remember what I did.